Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Elloian. Our guest today is Steve Benen, a producer of The Rachel Maddow Show, author of the Maddow blog, and his newly released book, Ministry of Truth: How the Republican Party is Promoting Historical Revisionism, including a false record of the former president. Steve's articles and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Monthly, The American Prospect, Salon, and others. He has received 2 Emmy Awards for his work on The Rachel Maddow Show and has been nominated for 4 more. Let's welcome Steve Benen. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I read your book, fascinating,
Thank you.
Ministry of Truth. It puts everything in perspective. It really, really does. So let's start. How do you feel? Well, the book is a tell-all about the Republican Party and the new Republican Party and the GOP. It's not the traditional Republican Party that I knew growing up. The Reagan Party and the George Bush Party. It's taken on a whole new life of its own. It's akin to a cult with Donald Trump as its elected leader. Why don't we start there, and why the revisionism here with the Republican Party and the selection of Donald Trump as its leader?
No, I mean, I think you're right in terms of the radicalization of the party that's unfolded over the course of several years. I think that a lot of us of a certain age can remember what it was like when the Republican Party was considered a mainstream governing party. They took policy making seriously. They didn't try to attack the integrity of the recent past or the integrity of reality. But we're dealing with a very different set of circumstances right now. I think that, Joe Biden frequently talks about this isn't your grandfather's Republican Party or your parents' Republican Party. And I think the president is right. I think that we're dealing with a qualitatively different kind of entity right now. And so, yes, I mean, in terms of my book, I talk a lot about, and I flesh out in great detail the ways in which Republicans have attacked the integrity of the recent past, of recent history. And while we're dealing with a party that also attacks the integrity of the distant past, generations past, in terms of attacking textbooks and college curricula. But my focus is on more recent past, on events such as January 6th and the federal response to COVID and the Trump-Russia scandal. All of those things are events that we all remember, that we experienced, we lived through. But at the same time, Republicans, I think, are engaged in this campaign to try and replace our memories, kind of overpower our memories with this alternate reality that they prefer. And they do that, of course, because that alternate reality is preferable to the one that we all experienced. They can't necessarily defend Trump's record on a great many issues, and so they decide that it's easier and better to just kind of replace that with their own version. And so it's a struggle that I think has a great impact on our politics, and that's something that I think more Americans need to appreciate.
You reveal the unsettling truth behind all this, but is it just for a pure quest for power, or is there some other more insidious motivation here?
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm not sure if I have an equally excellent answer because I think the answer is still kind of unfolding in real time here. I mean, I think certainly there's an electoral dimension to this. Republicans, like all candidates in the history of democracies, want to win elections. And so I think that they are pursuing those electoral goals in a variety of unhealthy ways, including attacking the integrity of the recent past. But I also worry about democracy itself, because really, when we're talking about democracy and how our political system is supposed to function, we rely on a foundation of shared facts and shared knowledge. And so when that foundation is corrupted by partisans with an agenda, I think that the effects are real, and they have a corrosive effect on how our political system is going to function, how it's going to operate, how it can persevere under various challenges. And so yes, to your question, I think that there is an electoral dimension to this. Certainly, we're dealing with candidates, politicians who want to win elections. And of course, we get that. But at the same time, I think there's a larger context to all of this, which is that democracy is put in danger when people try and attack the integrity of the recent past and the integrity of reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, I never heard of alternate facts before the Trump administration and candidacy. Never even came into my, idea of reality. But here we are. And what we see with our eyes is being discussed in a way that is antithetical to the truth. And and they don't seem to care. And that's my concern. How can they convince all these people of untruths that they see with their own eyes? And, I mean, look at all the people that died over COVID. And he was telling us, oh, it's just going to go away. You don't have to worry about it. What's going on?
Well, there's quite a bit going on, I'm afraid, but you're right. I think that there's a lot to this, of course. I think one of the problems is that Republicans have created an environment in which so much of their base has been conditioned to believe that outside sources of information are simply not to be trusted, that there are news organizations, they're all part of a conspiracy, that there are these liberals who are allied with a deep state, and somehow if you see information, that is the message that they receive. If you receive information that you don't like and that you find disagreeable, you should just reject it and instead believe what Donald Trump is telling you, and what Donald Trump's allies are telling you, and what conservative media is telling you, and what right-wing websites are telling you. And that creates this bubble, this information bubble, where real information, accurate information, reliable information just simply cannot permeate this bubble and reach people who do not want to be reached, who prefer to believe these, to borrow the phrase you just referenced, these alternate facts. And so it has this effect where we're not able to have a real dialogue necessarily about the major challenges facing the country and public policy on international affairs, constitutional law, and so on. We can't have real debates because we don't have a shared foundation. We don't necessarily even agree on what is true, what is real, what is reality. And so how can we have a constructive discourse when there are this divide between those who believe, those who are involved in a reality-based community, and those who find that offensive and choose to disregard it? It is a frustrating dynamic, to be sure.
It certainly is. And I've had conversations with people who align themselves with that movement. And it's impenetrable. You cannot, at least I haven't had success in trying to tell them, well, no, it's actually this way. They actually did incite violence on the Capitol, and they're like, and they buy into it, and nothing, I know myself, what I've said to them seem to penetrate. And in some instances, they'd rather forego a friendship than to delve into the real truth of what is really going on. And I find that really, really troublesome.
Yes, and I think adding to that, and I agree with what you just said, but just to kind of widen the aperture a little bit, I also think it's important to emphasize the importance of incentives. If you're a Republican official, or you're Donald Trump, or you're a Republican candidate, et cetera, if you're in this part of this movement and you realize that the more you lie and the more you create these alternate facts and the more you rewrite recent history, the more you do that, and then you find that it's working, you find that by and large, the vast majority of Republicans believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election and his response to COVID was terrific and the Trump-Russia scandal was discredited. The more you find, more Republican officials find that these tactics are working, well, then why change them? Why bother to try and go in a more responsible, reality-based course if you're finding that your tactics are succeeding? Con men continue to pull cons when they get more money. And similarly, Republicans continue to pull more cons if they find they're winning more elections and they're getting more money from their donors and so on. And so I think I'm sympathetic to your point, and I think we all have friends and relatives who are probably falling victim to unfortunate misinformation, and it's frustrating to try and deal with them and try and pull them back to reality and then fail. But at the same time, I also think it's important to emphasize the fact that Republicans will keep doing this so long as they think they can get away with it. And so really, when you think about it, when the election cycle to come is critically important because in this context, because if they win, they'll continue to do it more. And if they fail, they'll have an incentive to try and maybe change course.
Right. Now, one of the big things is in their platform these days, aside from all the lies and the misinformation, one thing I think is front and center was the economy. And in your book, you outline how the economy has done much better under Biden than under Trump. Um, Give us a synopsis of what you found in your research.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm glad that you asked about this, and not only because it's important, but I think it's determinative when it comes to the election. I think right now Donald Trump is a competitive presidential candidate because so much of the electorate is convinced that he
Mhm.
had great success in the economy. Donald Trump says on a nearly daily basis that he had the greatest economy in the history of the world, that human eyes have never before seen the kind of economy that he was able to create. Now, I understand that is affecting the election, but what I think is underappreciated is the fact that he's lying. And so here's what I found in my research. When we look at job creation, for example, the last 3 years of the Obama era were actually quite strong for job creation. And then if we compare that to the first 3 years of the Trump White House, Trump administration, job growth actually slowed considerably. Now, that is a fact that is uncontrovertible. We can just do the math. The arithmetic is unambiguous. And yet, to this day, the vast majority of Republicans, and in fact, most Americans, do not necessarily believe it because they haven't heard these facts. And those who have been presented with these facts just simply choose not to believe them. The same is true on economic growth. Now, as a candidate in 2016, Donald Trump made all kinds of bold and ambitious promises about 4%, 5%, 6% GDP growth. He failed spectacularly to achieve any of that. Now at this point in the process, some of your Republican listeners are hearing this thinking, well, yeah, but COVID shouldn't count because the economy, obviously, there's a recession in 2020, COVID wreaked havoc on the economy. And so maybe that skews matters a bit. And that's a fair point, except even if we take 2020 out of the picture altogether and just completely disregard the data from 2020, Trump's first 3 years were underwhelming. The economy was fine. Stock market growth was fine. Job growth was mediocre, but it wasn't record setting. So my point is not that the economy was terrible in the first 3 years of Trump, but my point is that if you're under the impression that they were somehow an economic nirvana, that he was somehow able to produce magical results, the data proves otherwise. The evidence proves otherwise. And so to believe that is to believe a lie.
But again, once again, he says it so people believe it, even though the data, it's akin to what we saw on January 6th. We saw it with our own eyes. It was televised. We saw what was going on. They weren't patriots. So that if people, my point is, if people don't believe their own eyes, how are they going to believe government data? And I find that very troublesome.
Right. I agree. It is frustrating to put it mildly. And so the question then becomes, well, what are the consequences? And the consequences are that democracy is funny that way. We get what we deserve. If people choose to believe an alternate reality and they choose to believe rewritten history that is just completely at odds with the facts and in fact at odds with the evidence, well, then we will get Donald Trump in office and we will all suffer the consequences accordingly. But that's really where it comes down to is we make these decisions at the ballot box. We resolve our differences at the ballot box. And so if voters fall for cons and believe misinformation, well, then we'll all suffer the consequences together because we'll have the electoral results that they've chosen.
Yeah, unfortunately, the whole country and the whole world will suffer as a result of misinformation. I just don't remember, like I said, growing up in this country, ever having so much disinformation masquerading as truth. I just don't recall it.
No, and I think that's right. And I think it's an important point. I think that, it's true that, one of the points I make in the book is that as long as there have been authoritarians, there have been efforts to rewrite history. That what we're seeing now is not entirely unique in terms of the global misinformation campaigns. Under Stalin, there was intense misinformation campaigns and on and on. There's too many to mention. But I think you're right that what we're dealing with in the United States is new to the United States. In the American tradition, there's always been propaganda, of course, but we have not had a situation in which a major political party and a major political party's nominee and a former president, when at the time sitting president, simply tried to bamboozle people at this level. We know certainly there have been liars in American politics, and I wouldn't suggest otherwise, but we have not dealt with this unique campaign, systematic campaign to rewrite the very nature of reality, trying to tell us that not to believe our lying eyes. That is unusual. in the American tradition. And so, yes, it has always happened in authoritarian regimes, but we as Americans are not accustomed to seeing this dynamic, and yet it is unfolding before our eyes.
What is even more troubling to me is watching the US Supreme Court enable him. Uh, in our history, when Richard Nixon did his dastardly deeds with Watergate and all that, I mean, I give Richard Nixon some credit here. I mean, he resigned. He resigned. And, but we're right now, we have a US Supreme Court that's actually not only enabling him, but insulating him. What are your feelings on that?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned Nixon because I've read a lot. I've studied Watergate extensively, and one of the things that I think often overlooked by the public right now is that Nixon resigned, and I think that was the right move, obviously, but he resigned because he wasn't given much of a choice. Not only did the Supreme Court rule against him in an important 9-0 U.S. versus Nixon ruling, but congressional Republicans went to the White House and said, "Mr. President, your time is up. There's the door. Time to pack your bags and off you go." Congressional Republicans knew that this was a member of their own party, whom they had supported for years, but they were presented with the evidence and said, "It is time to go." Where is that Republican Party now? As scandals have mounted throughout Trump's first term, where were congressional Republicans? Well, they were rallying behind him and pretending that these scandals weren't real, lying to the public, deceiving the press, and so on. Because as far as they were concerned, it was more important to be loyal to their partisan ally than it was to be loyal to the truth. And so really, and I emphasize this because I wouldn't want your listeners to think that my entire book and my entire thesis is just about Trump. It's not. It's about a political party. It's about the Republicans' war on the recent past, not just Donald Trump's war on the recent past, because no one person can do this by himself or herself. It takes a political party, it takes allies, it takes entities who are going to support these efforts. And so my disappointment and my frustration with Trump is not just about one person. It's about those who enable him and continue to stand behind him and allow these things to happen because their party says it should.
So party over basically the Constitution.
Among other things. I mean, party over the Constitution, party over the rule of law, party over facts, party over reality, party over the integrity of recent past, and on and on. It's about party first above every possible consideration.
And then you have actors like Elon Musk. I find that very troubling because social media in and of itself, we never had to deal with that in the Nixon era and in any of the others. But now, not only do you have a presidential candidate that has his own social media platform, you have Elon Musk, who owns Twitter, now X, which has more viewership, I think, than any other. And that provides more disinformation that really plays havoc with the minds of these maybe low information voters that don't really seek out the truth and just, grasp at any information that's fed to them either by, Twitter, Fox News, or whatever. Do you see any way to combat that? I also am frustrated with the fact that mainstream media hasn't been asking the right questions. I mean, they focus more on President Biden and his age. And then you have someone similar in age, obviously has in some incapacities, especially to tell the truth, and they don't focus on that. Why is that?
Well, I think on the latter point, as it relates to coverage of Donald Trump and his cognitive failures at times, I think you are raising an important point. I mean, I know I can't speak for all media. Obviously, I can only speak for myself. But I have made a point in my work and my day-to-day coverage at MSNBC to try and be as balanced on that front as possible. That yes, obviously Joe Biden's age was a relevant story, and there's no denying that. But at the same time, Donald Trump has had just as many slip-ups, gaffes, age-related cognitive failures, at least as many, if not more, than the incumbent president. And so to me, that is an equally of at least as important as an issue in terms of the 2024 elections. And so I've made a point to try and cover that. My hope is that we're starting to see some additional coverage along that lines. The day of the presidential debate, for example, the New York Times had a big write-up about Donald Trump facing these kinds of questions about his age and his fitness for office. And I think that was a step in the right direction. My hope is that in the coming weeks, I mean, here we are, I think it's 46 days until the election. My hope is that as Donald Trump continues to say very strange things and struggle with the language and struggle with reality, my hope is that the coverage will continue on that path and that the voters will see more and more coverage of that. I don't know if that's true, but my hope is that that is the case.
Mhm.
And then in terms of social media, we talked about early in the program, we talked about these information bubbles, and it creates this problem that I think is just so fundamentally unhealthy. There are folks out there who are able to just simply pick and choose which voices they want to believe and which voices they want to hear, follow them on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, and then hear nothing else. This is their only sources of information. They rely on Fox, they rely on conservative radio, and they rely on social media. They're following people who tell them what they want to hear. And that, of course, is deeply unhealthy. If you're closing yourself off to accurate information and independent sources of information, you are not going to be informed. That's just not the way this process is going to work. And so, yes, it is as serious a problem for our democracy as anything else that I think we're currently facing.
Mhm. Now, let's shift gears a little bit about, I want to talk about, you outline in your book the issues surrounding Ukraine. Um, Tell me a little from what your research has uncovered. What were the real facts there in the Ukraine issue?
Well, the Ukraine scandal, I think, is one of those scandals that has been largely forgotten by too many people. And I'm sympathetic to the point that when we talk about a Trump scandal, well, that's a long list. And so when thinking about impeachment, there are probably people who are thinking, well, which impeachment was it? It was the impeachment of January 6th. There were the federal criminal indictments. There were state criminal indictments. So what is the story about Ukraine all about? Well, that wasn't too long ago. This was one of the defining scandals of the Trump era. But what we had was a situation in which Donald Trump, while Ukraine was facing threats from Russia, Donald Trump told the Ukrainian president Zelensky, he said, "Well, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to research Donald Trump. Pardon me. I want you to research Joe Biden. I want you to uncover dirt related to the Biden family, and I want to be able to use all that dirt to try and derail Biden's presidency." And Donald Trump said, "In the meantime, while you're doing that for me, I'm going to withhold security aid, congressionally approved security aid that you're entitled to because Russia is breathing down your neck." So in effect, what we had was an incumbent Republican president who was trying to extort a U.S. ally abroad in a way that's going to threaten security in Eastern Europe as Russia breathed down the neck of it. This was, of course, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so all of this evidence came out. It was overwhelming evidence that Donald Trump had committed this high crime. And there was nothing to refute any of it. He was caught red-handed. We had White House sources who came forward with sworn testimony proving that Donald Trump was responsible for this outrageous and illegal scheme. And fortunately, Congress was able to hold him accountable for that. He was impeached in the House, and then, of course, the issue went to the Senate, where Senate Republicans decided not to convict the incoming president at the time. But the significance of this scandal is so dramatic because it proved a variety of things, not the least of which is that Donald Trump is willing to cheat. He's willing to use the levers of federal power in order to secure his political ambitions, which is antithetical to everything that exists in the United States system. It is antithetical to the bedrocks of our Constitution. And yet Donald Trump did it anyway. And there's nothing to stop him from trying to do it again in a second term, because at that point, he's confident he'll be able to get away with it. And so I'm glad that you brought this up, because I kind of feel like that is a scandal that has been largely forgotten by many. And in the interest of disclosure, I should mention that my boss, Rachel Maddow, has a new documentary about this, and it debuts tonight on MSNBC.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to that documentary. It's just, I remember seeing Alexander Vindman and all the others, testify.
Yes.
And, a true patriot who really wanted to do the right thing. Even Ambassador Taylor, they all told the truth, and yet it didn't move the needle at all. And so it leads me to the question: can this person walk down Fifth Ave and shoot somebody and get away with it?
I think the answer is that there is a great many people who would in fact gladly look the other way. That they would say, "Maybe Donald Trump had a good reason to shoot that person on Fifth Avenue," or "I didn't see that shooting on Fifth Avenue. I turned my head just at the wrong time." But but the only thing I would disagree with you about is that there was no real accountability, because I think there was. I mean, yes, it's true that Donald Trump was not convicted in the Senate for
Right.
in the Ukraine scandal, but at the same time, he was impeached, and that is
Yeah.
on the books forever. And
Yes.
later, and then less than a year later, he lost that election. He was held accountable by voters. 81
That's right.
million people, 81 million Americans said, "Donald Trump, you're fired." And so there was some accountability insofar as he lost. He was impeached, and then ultimately he lost. And so my hope is that well, ideally that would have been a rebuke that mattered. And Donald Trump, of course, no longer thinks that that's the case. But my hope is that there are enough people who remember those events that it will affect the outcome of the 2024 election as well.
I hope so. And also I hope they remember the events of January 6th. I mean, that
Yes.
was an attempted coup on our government. And I don't understand how people, and those, we know there's a lot of people that took part in that had connections to the US Supreme Court.
One of the things I write in the book was that when January 6th happened, and we're all seeing the events unfold on our television screens, and there are so many images that are just are ingrained in our memories right now that we will never probably forget, in terms of seeing
No.
the rioters and the Confederate flag being carried to the halls of Capitol Hill, and the people the man who put his shoes up on Nancy Pelosi's desk. I mean, these are just images that we will not soon forget, nor should we soon forget. And my thinking at the time, well, I had a lot of thoughts, of course, at the time, but one of the things I was thinking was that, well, no one will be able to rewrite this story. It's
Right.
impossible. It's impossible to rewrite a story that we all witnessed, the whole world saw
Mhm.
unfold on our television screens. No one could possibly try and tell us that we didn't see what we all thought we saw. It's impossible. And yet, here we have a political party that says, no, we're going to rewrite that story too, and that this was a normal tourist visit. And really, they're patriots, and really, they deserve pardons. And we should call them hostages if they're being held accountable for their own felonies. This is a political party that genuinely seems to believe that and expects us to fall for it too. And to my mind, what could be a more important issue in the 2024 elections than the fact that the Republican nominee was in office 4 years ago, well, nearly 4 years ago, and deployed an angry and violent and armed mob to his own country's capital to try and keep him in power by force. What could be a more important issue? And yet, the polls suggest that Donald Trump still has a reasonably good chance of winning the presidency and being inaugurated in January. I think in large part because he's had some success in rewriting that story and convincing so many of his followers that his version of reality is better than ours.
And let's not forget the noose to hang his own vice president,
Of course.
which begs the fact that he had to get a new vice presidential candidate because, well, there's not too many vying for that spot, because you don't know how it could end.
That's a very good point. If I were applying for a job, I'm not, of course, but if I were applying for a job and I learned that my predecessor was put in danger, his life was put in danger by my soon to be boss, I might try a different job. I might, maybe I'll apply for something else. But here we are.
The job longevity really wasn't too good in that one, but yeah. So where do you see? Well, first of all, in your book, you outline, the incompetence with COVID, the incompetence with the relations with international relations, how he's, despised by many in the international community. How does a man who's despised by so many get so much levity from a party that should know better? They should really know better. After Nixon, they really should know better.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to this, but the first part of the key part of this that comes to mind is the fact that I think so many Republicans right now are afraid. I think they know better, and yet they feel as if their own power, their own offices, their own future is dependent on on displaying a sycophantic attitude towards Donald Trump, because they fear that if they were to in any way break ranks and show some independence and care about the facts and care about evidence, that Donald Trump would come down on them and the Republican base would turn on them, their donors would turn on them, conservative media would turn on them, and their careers would be over. In fact, those fears are not unrealistic. Look at Senator Mitt Romney of Utah. Now, here is a man who, in the not too just a decade ago, was the Republican Party's presidential nominee, and yet here he is right now retiring from public life because he stood up for reality on a handful of occasions. He's still a conservative Republican, don't get me wrong, but on a handful of occasions he stood up and said, "No, I disagree with Donald Trump. I think he's wrong." And we're now seeing the consequences. He's being drummed out of the party. He's considered a joke. He's considered a punchline. Most Republicans don't even want to acknowledge his existence. They don't want to say his name. He can't run for re-election in Utah, a state where Mitt Romney was a shoo-in up until fairly recently, where he won election the first time by an overwhelming margin. When Mitt Romney, of all people, cannot be a Republican in good standing, along with Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and other Republicans who were conservative for their entire careers. But they said no to Donald Trump, and then they were just run right out of the party. Well, what does that tell the rest of the party? Well, it tells them that if you want to have a future,
you better get in line.
Well, yeah, right, exactly. And so, you're asking about why they go along, and the answer is because they want to stay in office, and the only way to do that, as far as they're concerned, is to just toe the line and go along and just put their thumbs up alongside Donald Trump's thumbs up. And so it is until voters say otherwise, that will continue.
Yeah, integrity doesn't seem to matter much more. I would think that, if a group of them got together and said, hey, this guy's really out in the left field here, let's band together and, let's embrace a moderate candidate. I think they're just cowards too. I think it's a very cowardice position that they've taken, where they've extolled him. They've put him on a pedestal where he doesn't belong, and the country is suffering. You have Kamala Harris, who's a very, very accomplished woman. Definitely, she has all the credentials, just as did Hillary Clinton. And I see these sexist comments coming left and right that would never be directed if she were a man. I find it appalling, and I find it a very, very there is a very low threshold for these type of people in an intellectual society, but yet here we are, and they gain traction, which it shouldn't be.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, misogyny is disgusting. The racism is disgusting. There's no defense for any of that. And I think, when we look ahead, I think that it creates a test. I think it creates a test for all of us. What kind of country are we? What kind of people are we? What kind of future do we want? What kind of character? What kind of character do we have as a people? And so that test is going to be coming up in 46 days. If we're going to. It's not a test of Donald Trump's character. It's a test of our character. He's already flunked his test. We already know he has no character. So the question then becomes, what about our integrity? We as a people. And so are we the kind of people who are going to tolerate a racist, sexist buffoon to be held to hold the nation's highest office again? Are we that kind of people? And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I see the polls just as everyone else does. And I know that Kamala Harris seems to have a modest lead, but we don't know what it's going to look like again in 6 weeks or 6.5 weeks. And of course, the polls can be wrong. They've understated Donald Trump's support in the past. And so I know we're short on time, but just that is the point I think that a lot of us need to emphasize and look at when we look ahead is, are we going to tolerate that kind of behavior? Are we going to tolerate those kind of disgusting comments and disgusting perspectives? And I don't know the answer, but I live in hope.
Yeah. Well, they say, what's that old saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
That is well said.
Yeah. American people should reflect on that for a moment. We've been there. We had 4 years of Donald Trump, and it wasn't not a walk in the park. If anything, it was a living nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I think that so many people have forgotten the recent past. That Republicans have waged this campaign, Donald Trump has waged this campaign to try and overpower our memories, bully our memories into submission, as I put it in the book. But and so I wrote it in part because I want people to remember. I want people to know, yeah, that's those stories that you've been told by Fox and conservative radio and Trump and the Trump campaign and his allies. Those stories aren't true, and I can prove it. The
Mhm.
evidence, the evidence proves it. The facts prove it. And so that was that was in large part the motivation for putting these words on the page in the first place, is because I feel like the recent past is important. The recent past has been forgotten by many, but shouldn't be forgotten by many, because to understand our future, we need to know about our recent past. And so my hope is that folks will check out the book and get something out of it.
I hope so. And, people have to remember that to forget our historical beginnings lends us to repeat those same mistakes again.
Quite right.
Well, it's been a pleasure discussing your new book, and I look forward to Rachel's documentary this evening.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for being here. Thank you very much. I want to thank our guest, Steve Benen, for sharing his insights and opinions on the issues affecting our democracy and those who vie for and have occupied our nation's highest office. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guest, visit us online at thelegaledition.com. As always, this information is for educational purposes only. It is not to be construed as legal or personal advice. And please consult a qualified practitioner as to your own legal or personal needs. And don't forget, subscribe online. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter, now X. And subscribe to our publication on Substack.